Hi, everyone. Today we are going to be talking about some of the things that you need to know to live a healthier lifestyle. So let's go ahead and switch slides. So you can see some of the objectives that we have for today's session is to provide a more in-depth look at the dietary guidelines for Americans for 2020 through 2025, and highlight some of the key recommendations that provide further guidance on healthy eating across the lifespan. Switch. So just a little bit more about the dietary guidelines for Americans. They were released on December 29th, 2020, and they're mandated and published jointly by the USDA and the Health and Human Services every 5 years. They are providing science-based advice on what to eat and to drink to promote health, helping reduce risk for chronic diseases, and meeting your nutritional needs. Switch. So the first point that I want to highlight for today is the Dietary Guidelines is developed to help all Americans live healthier lives. It's based on scientific evidence on health promoting diets, and it's related to the general US population, which basically includes those that are healthy, those that are at risk for dietary related diseases, and those living with these diseases. Switch. So it's been increasingly clear that diet-related chronic diseases such as cardiovascular disease or type 2 diabetes, some types of cancer, and even dental caries actually pose a major health risk for Americans. And you can see in this slide today, about 60% of adults have one or more of the dietary-related chronic diseases. Switch. So in this edition of the Dietary Guidelines, they're highlighting the importance of encouraging healthy dietary patterns at every life stage, from infancy through older adulthood. For the first time, this is actually a guideline that includes recommendations for healthy dietary patterns for infants and toddlers. And I think it's also interesting just to note how they have changed the structure of the guidelines. They're providing guidance by specific stages of life. So the identifying of needs in each stage of life is helpful because it provides characteristics for each group that should be carried forward into the next stage of life. So some are very specific to each group, while others are going to be something that you want to carry with you as you progress through each life stage. But for the sake of today's conversation, we're going to kind of be focusing mostly on adult nutrition, just for the sake of time. Switch. So while the majority of our focus is going to be focused more on adult nutrition, there are some interesting nutrition data points that are related to more of the general American health that provides some pretty foundational insight across each life stage. Go ahead and switch. So most Americans still do not actually follow the dietary guidelines. It's kind of our third point for today. You can see here the average American diet scores at only a 59 out of 100 on the Healthy Eating Index, or the HEI. The HEI measures specifically the relativity of diet compared to the dietary guidelines for Americans. And research does show that the higher the HEI score is, the more an American's health will improve. Switch. So there is a scientific connection between food and health that shows some pretty substantial evidence that healthy dietary patterns can improve overall health for individuals and reduce their risk of chronic diseases through all the life stages. Long-term evidence has identified some eating patterns in the US that have remained actually far below the recommendations for different life stages. You can actually see those data points in this slide. They're as low as 51 for teens between 14 and 18, and they only go as high as 63 for those in the ages of 60 and above. But I do also want to highlight that this kind of scoring chart is from 2015, so it's a little bit outdated. However, I did want to point out that for the 2020 scores, some of the scores that are more important to the adult population are actually a little bit lower than they were in 2015. So the updated 2020 scores show that there is a 51 rather than a 59 total score for adults. And there is a 61 instead of the 63 score for ages 60 and above, which is still pretty low. And just noting that they've only since the last decade progressively gotten lower. Switch. So that brings me to kind of my fourth point for our topics of today. I want to discuss these 4 overarching guidelines which can support optimum nutrition health. You can kind of take a look at that first one on the top. Follow a healthy dietary pattern at every life stage. And then we're going to be following up with 2, customizing and enjoying nutrient-dense foods and beverages choices to reflect personal preferences and cultural traditions and your budgetary considerations. And then 3rd, focusing on meeting food groups' needs with nutrient-dense foods and beverages and staying within your caloric limits. And then that last point, the 4th, is just limiting foods and beverages that are higher in added sugars, saturated fat, sodium, and the limiting of alcoholic beverages. Next. So science supporting these guidelines can be found in the scientific report of 2020 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. You can find that online at the DGA's website. And the report examines the science on key topics related to diet and health. And this figure here kind of shows the outcomes that have strong or moderate evidence with relation to chronic disease and the pairing of that with healthier food choices. So I just kind of want to highlight the little orange box over in the right-hand corner for adults and older adults. With the improvement of dietary intake, you can notice a significant lowering of risk of some major chronic diseases: heart disease, CVD-related mortality, total and LDL cholesterol levels, blood pressure, obesity, total body fat mass, overall BMI, type 2 diabetes, certain cancers, and all-cause morbidity. And in favor, it also promotes better bone health. Switch. So a healthy dietary pattern supports appropriate caloric levels. I think we want to keep those 2 things in mind. A total number of calories a person needs each day does vary depending on a specific number of factors, namely, a person's age, sex, height, weight, and their level of physical activity as well. So due to reductions in metabolism that you might see as you continue to age and get older, there are some things that you want to keep in mind for different life stages with relation to that, what we call sarcopenia, which is the reduction of lean body mass. So in addition, need to lose weight or maintain weight or gain weight does affect how many calories one should be consuming. So you really want to have individualized recommendations that your dietitian gives you when providing more specific advice related to calories for your personal body's needs. Switch. Which brings me to my 5th point. The next topic is basically the importance of customizing and enjoying nutrient-dense food choices that reflect personal preferences, cultural traditions, and your budgetary considerations. Slide. So this just is nothing that you have to read on that figure 1.5, but if you're finding that you struggle with creative ideas on how to customize your diet, you can consider utilizing certain tools that you can find online, such as this figure over to our right. It's the Customizing Dietary Guidelines framework, and I think it's a really valuable online tool for those that want to understand how they can maybe expand their taste preferences or find better options within their budgetary restrictions, and take in cultural considerations as well. So these kinds of guideline frameworks can help accommodate each individual to meet them where they're at and make their dietary recommendations their own. So these are the types of tools that a dietitian is going to be utilizing with you to support you in your nutrition needs. Switch. So another subject that I think is pretty important is to mention selecting nutrient-dense food choices. When we're thinking about how to structure your dietary intake and types of foods within each food group, you want to choose foods that are nutrient-dense rather than energy-dense. So thinking of the difference between like the candy bar versus a handful of nuts and seeds. One is going to be higher in extra sugars and saturated fat, with a minimal amount of nutrient density, while the other is going to have energy density. It's also going to carry valuable nutrients that our bodies do need to function well. So there is going to be a little bit of limited space for extra calories from added sugars, saturated fats, and alcohol. It's kind of keeping that in mind. So most Americans have substantial room for improvement when it comes to food group intake. You can see this bar chart does show, on average, about 80% or more of the population have intakes that are below the recommendations for key food groups such as vegetables, fruits, and dairy. For grains, most of the population does meet or exceed the refined grain recommendation, but they do fall short for the recommendation of whole grains. And then more than 50% of the population looks like meets or exceeds the recommendations for total protein. But it's important to note that they are not meeting recommendations for subgroups within that category, such as seafood, nuts, seeds, and some soy products. Switch. So the current inadequate intake of nutrient-dense foods has resulted in underconsumption of some pretty key micronutrients, namely calcium, potassium, dietary fiber, and vitamin D. They're all considered dietary components of concern because of that low intake, which has been associated with health issues and disparities. So if a dietary pattern that is more healthful is consumed, amounts of calcium, potassium, and dietary fiber can actually be met based on the dietary recommendations for Americans. But individuals should consider making positive shifts to increase their overall intake of whole foods within each food group to mitigate the unintentional underconsumption of these nutrients. In some cases, fortified foods and dietary supplements can be useful, especially for things like vitamin D. But I think overall, just because of what I showed you on the prior slide with relation to some of the limitations in the average American diet, with relation to getting enough servings of each food group, it's important to really consider enhancing your overall whole food intake rather than focusing on supplementation. However, I do want to point out that vitamin D is a little bit different in that regard. It's harder to get vitamin D from natural sources unless there is maybe some fortification of vitamin D in certain foods or beverages like milk, for instance. So in many cases, other people in other states might be able to get a source of natural vitamin D best from sunlight. But again, because of limitations for where we are in the States and our climate, or the overuse of sunscreen, vitamin D is often limited for individuals, even if they are going outside. And again, specifically in Washington. So vitamin D, for that reason, is one that you would probably want to consider supplementing with. So it's important to remember to be getting nutrient-rich foods into your diet while also staying within the caloric limits. Just kind of as a small recap, you can take a look at that orange box that I have on the left-hand side. Keys to healthy dietary patterns include getting nutrient-dense forms of foods across all food groups in recommended amounts and within your calorie limits. And then on that right-hand side, you can see some core elements to a healthy dietary pattern, which are going to include basically each of the food groups, and also including oils and different foods that you can choose that are going to be more healthful choices within each of those food groups. Switch. So the 85-15 guideline can be a helpful way of thinking about the dietary intake for yourself. Most of the calories in a person's daily needs for nutrient dense foods are going to be about 85%. And those are going to be the calories that are going to help meet your body's overall needs for wellness, for energy levels. While the remaining 15% of calories are going to be available for use for things like fun foods. So, things that have added sugar, extra saturated fat beyond what is considered what is in natural, a small amount within more nutrient dense foods. So there's still going to be a little bit in foods that are in that 85%, but there is that subcategory of 15% that are specifically designated for more enjoyable fun foods. And that, I think, for an average adult is going to be roughly 250 to about 350 calories per day, if you wanted kind of an average example guesstimate for caloric intake. Switch. So nutrient-dense foods and beverages are going to be the ones that provide essential vitamins, minerals, and other health-promoting components, and have the limited amount of added sugars and saturated fat and sodium. So making some simple swaps in all the different food groups can and should really be considered for promoting better overall well-being with relation to your dietary intake. So just kind of taking a look at this slide here with the picture on that right-hand side, these are just a few examples of some pretty realistic but small changes that you can make to your diet for improving the nutrient density of your choices to adopt better patterns of eating. So you can kind of see, if you're a cereal eater and you might enjoy frosted shredded wheats, swapping out to have plain shredded wheats instead. If you're somebody who enjoys yogurt and you're getting full fat with the added sugar and flavoring, maybe swapping out to have plain or low fat yogurt with fruit added in on top. Regular canned beans might be swapped out for low sodium beans, butter for vegetable oil, and then sodas for something like sparkling water that doesn't have that added sugar intake. Switch. So our seventh key point is going to be honing in a little bit more specifically on 4 more quantitative recommendations which support the overarching guidelines. And that's going to be kind of that 4th point of including the limitations for foods and beverages that are going to be higher in added sugars, saturated fat, sodium, and alcohol. Switch. So some data related to the consumption of foods and beverages that are higher in these, added sugar, saturated fat, sodium. You can see that first point, 75% of people have dietary patterns that are low in vegetables, fruits, and dairy, while 63% are exceeding the limits for added sugars, and 77% exceed the limits for saturated fat, and even 90% are exceeding the chronic disease risk reduction limit for sodium. So those are pretty high numbers, I think, and something definitely worth considering in terms of how we rethink about what we're getting in. Switch. So when it comes to the specifics of the recommendations for each of these categories, added sugars should really be limited to less than 10% of your overall calories for a given day. Saturated fat is going to be the same. Sodium is going to be 2,300 milligrams or less per day. And alcohol, you really want to limit your intake to no more than 2 drinks or less for men and no more than 1 drink or less for women. And just as a small aside, if you're curious as to what an actual, serving of sodium might look like for 2,300 milligrams, it's about a teaspoon, which is really not that much. Slide. So my 8th kind of key point is just focusing more on the general patterns of eating. The dietary guidelines focus on combinations of foods and beverages that make up an individual's whole diet over time, and are trying really not to focus too much on single foods or eating on specific occasions in more of an isolated state. Research has shown that the ongoing pattern of an individual's eating habits is the thing that has the greatest impact on their overall health. So it's a pattern, not just healthy choices here and there. Switch. So I think this is kind of an interesting slide that I want to point out. Added sugars account on average for almost 270 calories, which is more than 13% of total calories per day for the average American. You can see on this slide, the major sources of added sugar come from sugar-sweetened beverages, looks like desserts, sweet snacks, sweetened coffee and tea, candies. So, together these food categories make up more than half of the intake of all added sugars, while contributing really very little to food groups in the recommendations. So individuals have many potential options for reducing the intake of added sugars. You could reduce the intake of, those major sources of added sugars. Strategies for that could be reducing your portion sizes or consuming these less often, or selecting options maybe to swap out to have those varieties of foods that are lower in sugar just naturally. Switch. Oh, excuse me, our slide deck looks a little bit different. So this was the slide that you were supposed to be seeing. However, I did want to point out an additional note for added sugars. For those with weight-related goals, specifically towards weight loss, limiting the intake of foods and beverages that are higher in added sugars is a strategy to help reduce calorie intake. It should be noted, though, that replacing added sugars with low and no calorie sweeteners may reduce your calorie intake for the short term, and they might aid in weight loss or weight management, yet questions do still remain, I think, overarchingly about their effectiveness as more of a long-term weight management strategy. So just kind of keeping that in mind if that's a goal of yours. So with relation to saturated fat, intake of saturated fat should be limited to less than 10% of calories per day by replacing them with unsaturated fat, and more particularly polyunsaturated fats. And the National Academy's recommendations for trans fats and dietary cholesterol consumption should be basically just as low as possible. Some examples of a polyunsaturated fat that you might want to swap out those saturated fats with could be something like nuts or seeds or plant-based oils if you're cooking. And a few extra notes on cholesterol and trans fats. They do occur in small amounts within natural food sources, mainly animal sources of food. But just kind of as an aside with relation to trans fats that have been incorporated into the American diet in the past, as of June 2018, partially hydrogenated oils, or PHOs as they call them, were a major source of those artificial trans fats, and they're actually no longer considered generally recognized as safe, or GRAS. So basically, those PHOs are no longer added to foods. Slide. So, sources of saturated fat, you can see here on this slide. And saturated fat is about 11% of the overall average American's diet. Only 23% of individuals consume amounts of saturated fat that are actually consistent with the recommended limits. And you can see here on the slide some of the main sources of saturated fat in the US diet are going to include things like sandwiches, so burgers, that includes tacos. It also includes burritos, desserts, sweet snacks, things like rice and pasta or other grains. Saturated fat is commonly found in higher amounts for things too, like full fat meat and dairy products. So, when cooking as a strategy, maybe selecting leaner cuts of meat might be one way to limit your intake of overall saturated fat, or replacing butter as a cooking oil with vegetable oils, or maybe swapping foods in your overall diet with better options such as nuts or seeds or avocados. Slide. So this slide is looking at the average intake of sodium. On average, the American diet has roughly about 3,400 milligrams of sodium that they're taking in per day. The range, though, is between about 2,000 to 5,000 milligrams per day. So only a small portion of total sodium intake is from sodium that is found inherently in foods or from added salt used in home cooking. So most of the sodium is consumed basically from added salts that are used in commercial products, such as food preparation from, previously prepared food items at the grocery store or at a restaurant. So as this slide basically illustrates, sodium is going to be found in almost all food categories, including sandwiches, burgers, tacos, rice. And because sodium is found in so many different foods, it's really important to implement a variety of different strategies to include in terms of limiting the amount of intake that you have of sodium. So considering maybe cooking more at home, paying more attention to nutrition facts labels and choosing products that might have less sodium on them, or maybe even swapping out, salt with herbs and spices as flavoring. Slide. Go ahead and slide again. So let's see. Some of the key dietary principles that I want to kind of highlight here, just to kind of close up our time. Meeting nutritional needs should be coming primarily from foods, not supplements. Choosing a variety of options from each food group, and also paying attention to portion sizes is pretty important. Slide. You can see here, this is a photo that shows how someone might make simple swaps to their dietary intake to better their overall health. So that first image on the left-hand side is a typical meal, and the second is going to be kind of demonstrating improvements that could be made to a meal to make it more nutrient dense. So the typical meal on that left-hand side is going to be about 1,100 calories. And after some simple swaps, it has had a reduction in overall calories while improving the nutrient density. So it's closer to 700 calories. The shift in terms of how the ingredients have switched is, the rice has been changed from white to brown. Using reduced sodium black beans has been another swap, increasing the amount of vegetables, reducing saturated fat through a reduced saturated fat cheese, and then also removing the sour cream from the list. So another one is the beverage. It's sweetened versus unsweetened tea. Swapping out the sweetened with an unsweetened choice is a great swap. Slide. So to close, I just wanted to point out my last kind of key topic is you have a call to action. You can make every bite count. So it's never too early or too late to eat healthfully. And, if you are somebody who finds that you might need a little bit more support with how to make simple swaps, or knowing how to meet your personal body's needs given the health that you currently have in this stage of your life, I'd highly recommend that you work with a dietitian to be able to support you in your health goals that you have for yourself. And that is the end of my presentation.